This is an ABC podcast.
Hi, I'm Amanda Vanstone. You're on RN. This is Counterpoint. Welcome or welcome back. Remember the first week or so of COVID? The shutdowns? Cities were like ghost towns. But innovation is alive and well, certainly in Paris. Cities can adapt. Well, their managers can. And slavery. Does that make you think of the Deep South in the United States? Often appalling treatment of slaves by white slave owners? White is not the only colour to think of. And New Zealand, because of mining, they've come across the most fantastic storehouse of truly beautiful fossils. I'm not kidding you, they're fossils, but they are truly beautiful. They're intriguing, but mining might also put them at risk. But first, to the ever-present desire by some to make the world their way, rather than letting us as voters choose how we're governed. Southeast Asia is a dangerous zone for democracy. Living in a democracy means not only that we get to choose who governs us, but we get the rule of law applied. We can't be put into jail for no reason. The government has to show a case against us if they want to lock us up, and a whole range of other things. Democracy's been on the march forward in Southeast Asia, but is it now slipping? To answer that question, we're going to talk to James Chin. He's Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and he joins us now from Hobart. James Chin, welcome to Counterpoint.
Great to be here.
Well, what's happening in Southeast Asia? It was once regarded as a strong point for democracy moving ahead, but it's a bit worrying now. What would you sum it up as? Let's introduce the topic with a summary.
Sure. So basically, I made the argument that for the last couple of years, democracy has been receding in Southeast Asia. And the fact that 10 years ago, people thought that democracy was going to sweep through Southeast Asia, that didn't happen. And I also made the argument that people should not expect democracy or liberal democracy as we understand it to take root in Southeast Asia.
Well, why do you think it's been rolling back? Is there an overriding explanation for problems in, for example, Myanmar and Thailand?
I'm not sure you can put it to any one single explanation, but I think for the last couple of years, you had sort of elections happening in the region where they started things sort of right-wing politicians.
Yeah.
A perfect example of that is the Philippines, where they elected a guy called Duterte. The interesting thing about Duterte was that he told you exactly what he was going to do when he became president. He told the Filipinos that I'm going to start shooting people. I'm going to get rid of the drug dealers. I don't believe in democracy. I want to turn, the Philippine presidential system, the parliamentary system. So basically, the Filipino people were quite happy to elect a right-wing president. In the case of countries like Malaysia, people thought that Malaysia was going to becoming more democratic because in 2018, you had the first regime change after 60 years of single-party rule. But last year, after 2 years of the Pakatan Harapan government, the reform government, it all fell apart when the right-wing elements in the government decided that, we'll do a backdoor government, we'll bring all the right-wing groups in Malaysia, come together and create a new right-wing Malay government. Now, the case of Thailand is much more interesting. In Thailand, they had a series of elections, but the right-wing elements in Thailand essentially making up of the military and the palace. If they don't like the government being elected, what they do is they just do a coup. Now, in the case of Thailand, a coup is a very normal thing. You can have a coup in the morning, and in the afternoon, the Thais will go shopping. Not a problem. But in the case of Thailand, what happened was that the old king died, and you had a new king. Now, this king has very distinct ideas about what democracy is. And I made the argument that he doesn't believe in democracy at all. In fact, he's trying to reclaim a lot of the political powers that he lost during the constitutional monarchy years. So basically what he's trying to do is he's trying to take back political power, and he has the support of the military. So in the case of democracy, you can see that all these countries that, say 10 years ago, people were talking about the rise of the middle class, more democracy, more freedom. You can see that they're all receding. Yeah. Even the bright spot of Indonesia, and Australians like to think that Indonesia is the democracy. If you look at some of the recent political trends, I think you have to worry about it. So for example, the Islamic groups are getting stronger and stronger in Indonesia. And you can see that the current President Jokowi have not really cracked down on the right-wing Islamic groups. In fact, in the last election, he actually had the support of the Islamic groups because he chose a vice president who was sort of a link between his government and the various right-wing Islamic groups.
You're on RN. This is Counterpoint. I'm Amanda Vanstone. I'm talking with James Chin. James is Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and we're looking at the decline of democracy in Southeast Asia and what the future might hold. Now, the people who want to promote democracy in these countries face a bit of a problem because they need help and they want help, and they're looking to the West to provide that. But you point out that a problem for them is they can be accused of being Western agents, and that might drive people into the hands of the autocrats. So it's a difficult road for people to travel down where they want to help and protect democracy without getting a lot of help from the West. What do you say to that?
I think there's a lot of truth in what you've just said. I think the other thing you need to remember is that in the last few years, two other things are happening which makes democracy a lot more difficult to promote in Southeast Asia. Besides the rise of the right-wing element, you also had the rise of China. I think it's fairly obvious for anybody who knows Southeast Asia. They can see that Southeast Asia, or at least from Beijing's point of view, they see Southeast Asia as its backyard. And Beijing is not exactly going around promoting democracy.
No.
It's probably promoting something else. So that's the first trend. The second trend, interestingly enough, is that more and more of the middle class in Southeast Asia are actually turning right as well. Now, as you know, right, under democratic theory, if you have a large middle class, the middle class is supposed to act as a check against the executive. In other words, the middle class would claim for more reforms, blah, blah, blah. But this did not happen in Southeast Asia. So when you look at Southeast Asia, people are always talking about, the hundreds of millions of people moving to the middle class, especially in Indonesia, and sooner or later, these people will ask for democracy. But in the last few years, the reverse has happened. In fact, many of these right-wing groups are situated among the middle class. So it's really quite interesting what's happening in Southeast Asia now.
And they don't easily fit into one bucket, do they? I mean, there's quite a degree of diversity in terms of democracies. They had colonial powers of one sort or another who weren't that keen on democracy when they were there but thought it was a great idea when they left. So you have different, not so much different models, but different stages of democracy. Well, you do have different models, and not really a common thread.
No, I suppose if you want to look for a common thread, the only common thread is that all the ex-colonial powers started promoting democracy in a serious way after they left the country. The other thing I think that's important for your listeners to understand is that very often when the colonial powers left the region, and we're talking about post-Second World War, say from the 50s onwards up to the early 70s, one of the things they did very early on was that they pick and choose the elites of those countries that they wanted to hand powers over to. It is fairly obvious that especially the British, they wanted to pick local elites who were very friendly to the British. Obviously, if you leave those territories, you want the new government to be friendly to you. Now, the problem is very often the elites they chose were the traditional power holders in those societies. So we talk about a group of people who believe in feudal rule. So when they finally managed to get power for themselves, got rid of the colonial past, these people never believed in democracy in the first place. So while they were holding elections, what you have you, it was all very on the surface type of things. beneath them, they were still promoting this idea of a feudal power. A very good example of this, and I'm sure a lot of Australians will understand this immediately, is that, if you go to even places like Java or Indonesia, right? You go to many of the smaller cities there, you find that there are sultans all over the place. In theory, they don't hold any political power, but everyone will tell you they're still very influential because of this feudal system. So this traditional authority or traditional power is coming back in a big way.
No easy answer. Now, that might be, and you suggest this, waiting for the next generation, a generational shift to come on, who, through the internet and media generally, understand what they're missing. But, you mentioned before that a middle class hasn't necessarily done it for all of Southeast Asia. What makes you confident, or are you confident, that the next generation who want a real democracy, they want to be able to say what they think, not be put in jail, they want the rule of law, etc., not just, what have they got, guided democracies, I think you call them, where you get to vote, but behind the scenes you're voting for people that have already been sort of pre-picked, if you like. They want real democracy. Do you have confidence that they'll demand it in the end?
I suppose I was trying to sound positive. I didn't want to sound negative all the time. But I think what happens with the younger people, the new generation, I think they have a completely different mindset. And I think the reason why they have a different mindset is because I think in the last 10 years, the world has changed completely, especially last year with COVID-19. I think the way we work, the way we live, everything has changed tremendously. And I think the key thing about the next generation compared to the present middle class or the present generation is that I've noticed that among young people, they don't really recognize borders anymore. So if you speak to a young person living in Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, or Manila, I'm quite happy to bet you that this younger generation, right, they don't really care where's their first job, whether it's back in the Philippines or Malaysia or Singapore or Indonesia. They'll go to wherever they think they'll get the experience. So you find that a lot of these young people, right, they're quite happy to start a new job in places that they'll never consider set 10 or 15 years ago. I know lots of young people who graduating from Malaysian universities, they're now taking their first job in places like Hong Kong and China. 15, 20 years ago, they would have never done that. 15 or 20 years ago, if they get a chance, they would like to work in the West, but that's no longer the case. So my point is that the expectations of the younger people, the new generation, are completely different. Once they go and try out different countries, different systems, they'll realize that, if they push for democracy, it's actually for their own good. So that's the reason why you can see things like the umbrella movement. The really unique thing about the umbrella movement and also the counter-coup protesters in places like Myanmar right now, these are university students. They haven't even graduated yet. Some of the people in the umbrella movements, the key leaders, are actually high school students. And this is quite remarkable.
Certainly is. James Chin, it's been a pleasure talking to you. No doubt we will talk again.
Thank you very much.
Speaking of democracy at risk, we now know, don't we, that big cities, new development doesn't mean democracy.